I'm Amelia. I'm sitting in my apartment, looking at the small painting on my desk. It's a 4-inch by 5-inch watercolor of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a piece I've had for 22 years. The memory of what happened at my mother's birthday dinner still feels raw, like an open wound that's slowly starting to heal. It all started 3 weeks ago when I got an invitation from Mr. Thompson, a board member of my company. There was a 7 p.m. board call scheduled to discuss the final approval of the Miller acquisition, a deal worth $14,200,000. I'd been working on it for months, and I knew this call was crucial. But I didn't tell anyone, not even my mother, who I was going to visit for her birthday. I live in a high-rise apartment in the heart of the city. At 6:15 a.m. The sky outside my 18th floor window was going through its usual transformation from black to orange, then to a soft pink before settling into a dull gray. I was used to ignoring the beautiful sunrises. With a 47-page due diligence report open on my screen, I couldn't afford to be distracted. I finished up the last details and sent the signed file to Mr. Thompson. 4 minutes later, I got the confirmation email. On my desk, between the legal pad and the phone charger, sat the small watercolor. I stared at it for a moment. It was a reminder of a time when I was 11 years old, a time when my world was so different. My sister, Lily, has always been the center of attention. She's charming, outgoing, and has a knack for making people feel special. She's also incredibly good at sizing up a room and finding the quickest way to the spotlight. When it comes to clothes, she can read the message they send even before the wearer does. I spent 8 minutes in front of my closet choosing what to wear to my mother's birthday dinner. I settled on a plain gray blouse. Gray is unremarkable, the kind of color that says, I'm just an ordinary office worker, not a threat to anyone. I paired it with small gold studs that I'd had since college. Dressing for invisibility has been my strategy for a long time, a way to avoid the kind of scrutiny that Lily seems to thrive on. I zipped up my garment bag, made a cup of coffee, and calculated the drive to my mother's place. It was about a 2-hour and 20-minute drive on the highway, assuming no traffic. I checked my calendar again. The 7 p.m. board call was still on. I told myself it was an experiment, a chance to let the truth be seen. But deep down, I knew I'd been planning this for a long time. As I drove, I thought about Lily. It wasn't anger that I felt, but a kind of clarity that comes from years of observation. Lily doesn't hate me, but she needs to be the most remarkable person in any room. Every time I went home, she'd ask about my job in a way that made it seem like she already knew I was a disappointment. Still at that company in the city? What do they do again? She'd say, with a tone that suggested there was something wrong with my career. 2 Thanksgivings ago, I mentioned a big deal I was working on. She nodded and said it was great, but then spent the next few minutes talking about her husband's business success. After that, I stopped sharing things with her. My childhood was marked by a similar incident. When I was 11, our school had an art show in November. I'd been working on a watercolor of the mountains behind our house for 3 weeks. My teacher, Mrs. Jenkins, seemed to be watching me closely. But on the day of the art show, it clashed with Lily's piano recital. My parents told me they'd try to make it to part of my show, but Lily needed them there because she got nervous. I stood by my painting at 1:15 p.m. watching other families arrive with flowers and balloons. Not a single one of my family members showed up. At 2:40 p.m. they announced the watercolor category. I won first place. Mrs. Jenkins handed me a thick red ribbon with gold lettering and said, "I thought so." I folded the ribbon and put it in my jacket pocket. There was no one to share my happiness with. When my parents came home at 4:30 p.m., they were taking Lily out to celebrate her successful recital. My mother asked about the art show on her way out the door, and I simply said it went fine. 3 weeks later, when I mentioned that I'd won, my mother just said, "Oh, really?" in a distracted tone. I finally arrived at my mother's house at 5:30 p.m. The kitchen light was on, and I could hear Lily's voice through the window. She was already holding court. My mother came to the door before I even reached the porch steps. She hugged me tightly, and I noticed the new lines around her eyes. She said Lily wasn't sure I'd be able to come because of work, but I told her I'd moved some things around. The house was the same as it had been for years. The yellow kitchen, the creaky wood floors, and the smell of old wood filled me with a mix of nostalgia and unease. There was a large framed photo of Lily and her husband, Ryan, in Hawaii on the wall, and in the corner, almost hidden, was my college graduation photo. I sat at the far end of the dining table and placed my phone face down beside my plate. Lily's aunt, Martha, and her husband, Tom, arrived a few minutes later. Martha is a talkative woman who comments on everything, while Tom has the ability to sleep through almost any situation. My mother's friend, Sarah, also joined us. The first 20 minutes of dinner were pleasant. We had wine, passed the bread, and celebrated my mother's birthday with a small cake. Then, Lily turned to me. "So, Amelia, still at that company in the city? What's it called again?" she asked, already slicing into her chicken. It was a setup, a way to start her usual routine of making me feel small. I answered her questions about my job, but she kept pressing. She said I was like a middleman for companies, and then asked if it paid well. Meanwhile, she talked about her own brand-building efforts, claiming there was a lot of money in it. I did some quick mental math and realized her business was likely losing money, but I just said, "Interesting." At 6:42 p.m. Lily noticed my phone. She looked at it with that same casual confidence she's always had, as if she had the right to an opinion about everything that belonged to me. Something behind her eyes changed, and I knew she was starting to get curious. As the conversation continued, Lily asked me what I did on a day-to-day basis. I explained that I was involved in corporate acquisitions, but she kept trying to simplify my role, calling me a middleman. She also brought up Ryan's company's recent commercial project, a contract worth $800,000. At 6:54 p.m. my phone screen lit up briefly. Lily asked if it was a work call. I said it was a scheduled call at 7 p.m. She laughed and said it was typical for me to be working on a Friday. I told her it was a different industry. At 6:58 p.m. she reached across the table and picked up my phone. "Let's all hear who the janitor's been talking to," she said, hitting the speaker button. I sat there, my hands in my lap, waiting for what was to come. At exactly 7 p.m. the phone rang. Lily answered it. The voice on the other end was Mr. Thompson. "Good evening, Miss Amelia. This is Mr. Thompson calling from the board. The vote came through about an hour ago. Unanimous. The Miller acquisition is approved at $14,200,000. Congratulations," he said. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone at the table was in shock. Martha's mouth dropped open, Ryan set his fork down carefully, my mother stood still in the doorway, Sarah turned her chair towards me, and Tom, who was usually asleep, was wide awake. Lily was still holding the phone, her face a mask of shock. I stood up, walked around the table, and held out my hand. After a moment, Lily put the phone in my hand. I looked at her and said, "You wanted the room to see who I am. Now they do." Then I walked into the small sewing room off the hallway. I called Mr. Thompson back and we went over the paperwork for 11 minutes. When I came back to the dining room, the atmosphere was different. Ryan asked me about my job, and I explained it to him. Sarah asked how long I'd been at my company, and I told her 6 years. Martha complimented my blouse, saying it was sensible. Lily tried to say something to me, but I just said, "I heard you." She was taken aback. I then turned to my mother and asked about the roast. The conversation moved on, but the tension in the room was still palpable. After dinner, I went to the kitchen to wash the dishes. I realized that I'd won, but it didn't feel like I'd expected. I'd proven myself to the room, but it felt more like I'd put my childhood victory on display for everyone. The 11-year-old me, still waiting at the gym door with no one to share my prize with, was still there. My mother came out to the back porch and invited me to sit with her. We sat in the rocking chairs, sipping sweet tea. She said, "I know." I told her I hadn't tried to show her who I was, and she admitted it was partly her fault too. I told her about winning the art show, and she closed her eyes for a moment. We sat in silence for a while, and I realized that this moment was more important than the phone call. It was about finally having an honest conversation with my mother. On my drive home, I thought about everything that had happened. I'd been invisible in my family for 22 years, partly because of Lily's framing and partly because of my own fear of being dismissed. But now, I knew it was time to change. When I got back to my apartment, I sat at my desk and looked at the painting again. I picked up my phone and sent a message to my mother. "I'll come back before Thanksgiving. Just us if that's okay. I want to tell you what I do. I want you to know." 4 minutes later, she replied, "I'll make the roast. Tell me what day." Some victories require an audience, but some just require the right person. I'd been patient for 20 years, waiting for the right moment. And now, I knew that the most important thing was to have an honest conversation with the people who mattered most.